Robin, thank you very much for agreeing to meet with me this afternoon.
You're welcome.
We're here to mark your 25th year anniversary at AbilityNet, which is an amazing achievement, if I may say so. I'm hoping this afternoon that I might catch a few reflections from you on the changes that you might have observed during that 25-year period. So I've got a few questions for you, if I may. So thinking back to those very early days in AbilityNet, could you paint a picture for me of the relationship between tech, the tech vendors, the companies deploying that tech, and their disabled customers and employees? Maybe you might touch on the formation of AbilityNet, since I'm assuming you were there at the ground floor.
Yep, I certainly was. I mean, the 25 years actually goes from 1996 when I started with one of the two organizations that joined together to form AbilityNet. So there were two charities. There was FCD, the Foundation for Communications for the Disabled, that did assessments, assistive technology assessments in the Midlands area. And there was the Computability Centre that I worked for, which was, a branch of IBM's kind of special needs products expanded out into a charity. So I was based behind reception in IBM. If people can picture that, there's a small, room behind reception, and there was a little group of us, and it was so brilliant working for TCC. And then, in '98, there were conversations around merging these two organizations and forming a charity that would be all things technology and disability. And they were thinking about the name, and AbilityNet was finally decided on. And I thought it was a really good name because, ability, who would argue with that? And net is like network and the internet, and, it had a good ring to it. And starting with AB, I think we've all noticed that always at the top of the list in any alphabetical list of organizations. So that was a really, good idea, I thought. So yeah. AbilityNet, I mean, we were so different then. We were small. The landscape of technology was really quite different. Everything was specialist. So whilst, the big tech giants like Microsoft, for example, with Windows, which is what, the vast majority of people were using, the Mac and Apple weren't really on the horizon at all. Obviously, they were out there, but, they just didn't feature day to day. And the likes of Microsoft, thankfully, were providing the right cooperation and hooks, accessibility hooks for the minnows, the likes of Hunter Joyce, which is what JAWS was, developed by. That's what they were called back then, and Dragon, before they were the big, bought by Nuance, for example. They cooperated with them to make sure that they were able to work with Microsoft Windows 3.11 and Microsoft Office and stuff like that, and Internet Explorer 5 or whatever it was back then. So yeah, it was exciting times. The technologies that we were showing to individuals, I was an assessor back then, was, almost entirely specialist, was really quite expensive, but that's the nature of specialist, isn't it? And, but still nevertheless empowering, life-changing. My speech was sounded like a robot, but nevertheless, it meant that I could do my job. And, Dragon originally, you'd have to speak one word at a time. And then finally, it became Dragon Naturally Speaking, where you could say whole sentences, but you still had to, train on it for many hours and read lots of documents and have exactly the right headset and exactly the right processor and RAM and be in exactly the right environment. And we know that all of that has changed now. So yeah, that was the kind of landscape back then, but hugely exciting, really, really, so chuffed to have been working in this kind of area where technology is changing people's lives for all this time.
Yeah. So even 25 years ago, the landscape was beginning to form in a fashion that we would currently recognize it. So the PC at the center, Windows, Office, and a browser on most desktops.
Absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, so much has changed since then. As we know, 90% of jobs in the UK today use a computer of some shape or form. So whilst they were, you know, an absolute godsend for disabled people, they were often the exception, and they would need, you know, a really high-powered computer, and they would need the right adjustments to be able to work, you know, to do what their colleagues were doing potentially without technology. But yeah, things have come on a long way.
And if I asked you then to, I realize this is a one question that spans a very long period, but if I asked you to pick out a few really important developments or trends that had had the deepest impact on accessibility and the utility of tech for people with disabilities, what would be your reflections?
I mean, over 25 years, there have been some big milestones, but I would definitely say, I mentioned Apple not being even, you know, on the radar before. I would have to say Apple have been at the van of the two major changes, I would say, in the tech industry, and in how that's you know, impacted disabled people's daily lives. So the first one is that Apple decided to go all in on accessibility, and they have championed that ever since. And now we're very luckily in the kind of situation that whenever they bring out a new product or a new version of their operating systems or apps or whatever it might be, some new fangled technology like LiDAR, then we know that central, or at least, you know, key elements of that whole strategy and their thinking and implementation include accessibility. And, you know, Tim Cook, their current CEO, really champions accessibility, and, you know, famously on an investor call, when one of his, you know, major investors says, you know, what's all this money that you're spending on accessibility? You know, that is, you know, that's not going to get the returns that we're after. And he basically, I mean, he's a very mild-mannered man, but he was very strident in his reply and said, look, if you think money spent on accessibility is not money well spent, then, you know, you're in the wrong stock. Get out of Apple stock, basically. Yeah. So yeah, Apple has made inclusive design and prioritizing accessibility in everything that you do sexy. Basically, every company wants to be Apple, and Apple have made it a mainstream consideration. So that's the first thing. I think they've really mainstreamed the idea of doing things out, you know, making products inclusive out of the box. And if you drew a spider diagram of iOS's settings app, for example, all the different settings within that app, over 60% of it will be those accessibility settings. So more than half of the whole big spider chart would be things that you can change on your phone, for example, that will help you optimize it for you. So that's really powerful. And then the other one that Apple have really made happen is the advent of mobile. And like you said a minute ago, it was browsers, it was desktop applications, big screens with big applications full of loads of information. And that's very empowering, but the learning curve is massive. And, you know, the advent of a small screen that has imposed discipline on designers, UX people, user experience people, who really, you know, were kind of going to town before and putting every last bell and whistle and kitchen sink in what they were doing. They really had to think twice about doing things in a very much more disciplined way. So I would pick an app over a desktop experience any day of the week when it comes to getting things done, because there's only a dozen or more things on the screen for me to worry about, because of, in particular, Apple and iOS, but also Android is definitely catching up. The toolbox that they've given developers to create apps with means that by default, without a huge amount of effort, those are more accessible than your average website or desktop application, for example. So that's been a massive bonus.
Yeah.
And if you combine that with all of the extra sensors that are in mobile devices, camera, GPS, accelerometer, all of those which I use on a daily basis with either the built-in functions of my smartphone or the likes of, you know, Seeing AI by Microsoft or Soundscape by Microsoft or other manufacturers of brilliant apps to help disabled people are available. You know, that has been a massive difference. So the advent of mobile, and just very briefly on mobile, because mobile computing is like extreme computing, everybody who, regardless of whether you've got a disability or not, is kind of computing on the edge every day, juggling your phone one-handed, sunny day, on a bumpy car journey, noisy cafe before COVID. So all of those have meant that, those requirements for accessibility is now well and truly a mainstream issue. So Apple have kind of pushed all of that into where we are today, and, where mainstream inclusion, built-in inclusion, is almost the sort of central pillar to what disabled people rely on in their daily sort of digital lives.
Well, not just disabled people, Robin. I mean, I think I completely follow your arguments that it's mobility that has transformed the penetration of computing and information technology into every corner of everybody's life, and no different for people with disabilities. And yeah, interesting to hear your observations that Apple have been if you like, the most prominent and most committed, shall we say, early leaders in all of that through that period. So if I just took you away from the technology for a second onto a third question about the role of governments and legislation in that period, that 25-year period, what do you think has been significant, and how might you compare that to the role of pure technology impacting the lives of people with disabilities?
It's definitely played a role, and we've come on a long way, but I would argue probably only very recently in a significant developments. But so yeah, back in 96 when I started, the DDA was freshly minted in 1995, the Disability Discrimination Act. There was lots of question marks over whether it covered digital, and it was only in 2003 when the government published a code of practice that accompanied the DDA, which mentioned that a blind person should be able to book airline tickets online, that it was beyond a shadow of a doubt that accessibility was covered, it was a legal requirement. And that's when organizations started to approach AbilityNet, for example, to say, can you help us? Because we're this tech and disability charity. So it was in 2003 that I went to our first client in London, Rufus Leonard, and talked about website and other aspects of digital and what's this web content accessibility guidelines all about and that sort of thing. And the accessibility consultancy team soon grew up from that need to meet the requirements of clients who were spurred on by the legislation. The business case has always been compelling, but it's only when I think the main, the carrots and the sticks are fully developed and utilized that we really see a difference. So the Equality Act then came along in 2010, sort of reinforced the requirement, made it a sort of a human right issue, but didn't really have any teeth. It was still kind of this background wallpaper to the landscape of inclusion. There was no proactive enforcement of the law. And that's such a key thing, which we've seen change in recent years with the public sector regulations coming from Europe. That was the last bit of European legislation to do with disability and inclusion that made it before the guillotine of Brexit. And that for the first time ever, had a proactive enforcement, monitoring, reporting element that really made local authorities, universities, central government. I mean, central government have been improving all along, but really we've seen a flood, haven't we, in the last few years from the public sector bodies that were affected. And so that's what we're calling for now.
Well, here's hoping that we still get the enactment or the local instantiation of the EAA as that develops, with teeth to accompany it.
Definitely. I mean, we see the likes of Norway, for example, that have for several years now have proactively enforced very enthusiastically, and SAS, their national airline, dragged their feet or their wheels maybe for a year, not making their website and their booking process inclusive. And it only took DIFI, their department that covered digital enforcement, they said, you've got 10 days, basically. If you don't fix everything within 10 days, we're going to start fining you 15,000 euros a day. And they did it in 10 days. So
had an energizing effect, no doubt.
Yeah, focus the mind. So I would love that to happen here across all sectors.
Yeah. Well, fingers crossed, we might get those tools in the next few years with EAA and associated pieces of legislation. So in closing, I have sort of one final question for you. I think you and I first met in person at the WCIT judging event in relation to a prize linked to artificial intelligence. Yeah. And I'm sure that technology wasn't around when you started your career at AbilityNet. So what technologies do you think will have the biggest impact on accessibility in the next few years, Rob?
Well, funnily enough, I'm going to say AI.
Oh,
definitely. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I would probably argue that machine learning, which is kind of at the heart of AI, was around with Dragon. It did improve as you spoke to it, but that was kind of very early days. And now we see, neural networks being built into the system on a chip in Apple's, iPhones, for example. In fact, the neural engine takes up a quarter of the real estate of the chip, of the system on a chip, more than the memory, more than the CPU, so that's definitely where all of their money is headed. And I really do think it's going to be helping. So for us today, with disabled people, we can benefit from the likes of the Echo, not going to say her name because there's one right here, Siri, and the likes of machine learning or AI to help recognize images, describe them to us, text recognition, voice recognition, obviously, all of those things. And so today they're helping us, but going forward, we can only begin to imagine what support there'll be. We've been having difficult times as disabled individuals. If you're isolated over the last year, not having that hands-on often support with you, right there and then. But at least with AI, when it becomes more and more sophisticated, it will really be of significant support to disabled people, regardless of what their particular needs are. And also company for many people, and safety, helping monitor people's medical conditions or, mental health potentially, and interfacing with the technology, with all the kind of biometrics, the neural link that Jeff Bezos has been talking about. I think AI is going to play a massive role, but there is obviously a downside to it as well. Capture, those evil things that you have to recognize, traffic signs half covered up by leaves, etc., to be able to complete that all important form submission process. For me, it's a garbled audio, which, these are getting worse and worse, harder and harder, because the site owners are in an arms race with the AI baddies who are using that machine learning to recognize those images or the garbled audio. So that arms race is a race to the bottom, and that's going to be a problem going forward. So we'll have to kind of watch that space. But I think that on balance, assuming that the robots and Skynet doesn't kind of get us all in the end, I think AI is going to be a huge factor in the future. And I'm excited about driverless cars and all that, the technology has. Google Glass, let's see if, not Google Glass, Apple Glass, I think, might be coming at WWDC. If
or some of Google Glass in a more acceptable form, perhaps.
Absolutely, yeah. No cameras, but LiDAR, please.
Yeah, indeed. Wow, and a very exciting landscape, in other words, for us all to look forward to, and the power that these technologies can bring to making life better for disabled people. As you say, the imagination is the only limit, probably. Robin, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts about the history of your period with AbilityNet with me this afternoon. I think of two things really that I just want to get over to you. One is the esteem in which you're held by all of your affection and esteem, your colleagues here at AbilityNet. We're very grateful that you're on our side, trying to help us get the best out of these vendors and this technology. And then secondly, obviously, we hope that there are many more years of collaboration within AbilityNet to come. for you. So thanks again for your time this afternoon.
Thank you so much. It's been a massive honor over the last 25 years, and hopefully you'll keep me on for many more. Thank you.
Looking forward to it. Cheers. Thanks, Robin.
Thanks a lot, guys.